You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Sadie Graham, BART Program Director for Link 21, a rail network planning program for the SF Bay Area. Sadie chats about planning for a second bay crossing and the potential for a suite of projects to improve regional connectivity. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting this podcast as well as Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We couldn't produce the show without your help. To join this merry band of dreamers and support the show, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. For $2 a month, we'll send you stickers and a handwritten note. For $10 a month, we'll send you one of our famous bus-only scarves. We just got in a new shipment, so are ready for the new year. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of the Overhead Wire, sharing information on cities around the world with our readers and subscribers. Join us and try our one-of-a-kind daily newsletter for 2 weeks free. No credit cards, just an email address by visiting theoverheadwire.com. We've got 71,000 news links in our archive tagged by topic, so sign up and search away. And finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning in Practice. Go to raymondunwin.com to find out how you can download the book in your podcatcher and listen to each chapter like an episode of the show. We have a free Word document with timestamps on the site as well. Well, Sadie Graham, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. I'm excited to be here.
So before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name's Sadie Graham. I'm the acting director for the Link 21 program, which is what we're here to talk about today. It's a coordinated effort between BART and Capital Corridor on behalf of transit in our region, well, actually our mega region. So I've been working for BART for almost 8 years. I didn't start as a transportation planner, but I am so happy to have landed at BART. I really enjoy my work. I studied city and regional planning and urban design and landscape architecture actually at Berkeley, which is what brought me to the Bay Area.
Oh, nice. I'm a planner too. No transportation specific background, but it's kind of what I dove into.
Well, everything leads back to housing and transportation. So
it does. How did you get into that? I mean, like what brought you to the Berkeley program? What was it when you were a kid that made you decide, or maybe when you're older, I want to be a planner?
Well, it's interesting. We were talking about Portland earlier. I moved there after undergrad, just trying to land somewhere. And it was after the 2001 bust. The economy was not so great. I ended up working as a gardener at a home for children who just needed a little extra help. And that gardening position, it transitioned into a horticultural therapist position, and which meant that I really got to just garden with kids who maybe didn't have that experience before. And it really, I think, was eye-opening to me how the landscape can be sort of such a healing environment or just really affect someone's mood or their quality of life. And so that led me down the path to landscape architecture here at Berkeley. And then when I was doing the program, I realized that I was also, I love the site-specific scale, but I was also drawn to that regional planning sort of scale. And so I stayed at the College of Environmental Design to get my master's in city and regional planning.
That's awesome. Yeah, the reason I asked that question is because people get to where they are so many different ways, and it's not, a standard path that folks go from studying this to being that, because you go your own route. But I have had a lot of university students say, oh, I appreciate that I didn't have to get a planning degree, or I appreciate that I didn't have to get a transportation degree to be in a position like that in the future. So I can kind of study what I want, but also I want to know, how people got there. So that's kind of why I asked that question.
Well, BART's been great too, because I really have had the opportunity to think at those multiple different scales, at the site scale of a station and, the access, multimodal access to a station. And now we're thinking, of a long range planning project for 21 counties. So I really enjoy the ability to sort of think on different sides. I think it makes every day exciting for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Do you remember your first time on the Transbay Tube?
Yeah. Wow. It was my first time on BART. I came to visit Berkeley to see if I wanted to go to school here. I'd stayed with some friends in the city. And then, so, I had that experience where you come up and the cranes of Oakland are to your left and, the sun is shining and it's February. So I had just been in Boston where it was like slushy and rainy. And, so I think all of that just culminated to really deciding that California was where I needed to be.
I think that gets a lot of folks, especially in a February, January
Yeah.
context. Well, so let's talk about a second crossing. I know this idea has had major discussions going back decades, but I'm curious what the history is of the second crossing idea.
Yeah, well, it really has gone back to before my time. It's been something that the region has looked at a number of times. Our regional planning agency, MTC, is the 9 county Bay Area Planning Agency. And so we've looked at a crossing a number of times in terms of capacity. Most recently, there was a study that was done that compared really rail versus new bridges. Because, I mean, for people who aren't really aware of, I guess, the geography of the Bay Area, it has a big bay in the middle of it. So, and on the west is the city of San Francisco and then the peninsula, and on the east is Oakland. The East Bay is a lot of housing and smaller office centers or centers of development. And so we have, I guess, 3 bridges that go across the bay to San Francisco and the peninsula. We have 1 current BART crossing. And I think there's a major amount of congestion that's on the roadways. And, pre-pandemic, BART was at its capacity. We had overcrowded trains regularly. And so the most recent study that MTC did, called The Crossing Perspective, I think, really looked at the benefits of different crossing options, bridge and rail, and did come out with a recommendation that a regional rail or BART crossing is the one, makes a lot better sense and serves more needs than another bridge. And then I guess in addition, taking sort of a step back, California has a state rail plan, and the last one was updated in 2040. And that also calls for more of an integrated network with a Trans-Bay crossing for Northern California rail. And, before that is before my time here, but I'm sure that as soon as, I don't know when the first person thought of it, probably as soon as the last paver was, placed for the last 2.
Probably so. Yeah, I'm sure people can go back and look at the newspapers and see, when there was a discussion about a Trans-Bay crossing of some sort, even if it was an automobile bridge. This process is called Link 21. When did this start organizing in this specific form?
Yeah, well, that crossing paper I talked about came out about 2 years ago. And then our program specifically got underway maybe a year and a half ago. And so in 2016, there was a regional bond measure to support BART that included some money to actually do some of the planning and development work, sort of beyond what had already been looked at before. And so for about a year and a half, we've been together and thinking about this program and really structuring the way in which we're going to do the planning and the alternatives design and development.
And so what are the parameters? Like, what organizations are involved? What's the geographic scope? What's the overall kind of mass of information you're having to take in to kind of start this process?
Yeah, it's a little bit mind-blowing. We are looking at the 21 county mega region. So if you check out our webpage at link21program.org, you can see a map, and it's quite large. So it's all the way from Yuba County, Sonoma County, down to Monterey County. So it's quite large. There's literally millions of people that live there. And then, BART has money, and I think I said we're partnering with Capital Corridor, which is a passenger rail. BART is the managing agency for Capital Corridor, so we already have a natural relationship. The Capital Corridor is essentially representing standard rail for the region, right? So we are definitely coordinating with all the other rail operators within the region, but Capital Corridor is our day-to-day partner.
I think the thing for me is looking at that map, it's such a large geography, but it's such a small kind of sliver of where the project might go. I mean, you're not going to have a tunnel go from San Francisco directly to Sacramento, but it's that one single project. So it's interesting to think about why the geography is so large in that discussion.
Well, maybe I need to step back a little bit, because I think the way we're describing Link 21 is really a program of projects. So the program really will build upon and transform the existing passenger rail network. So it'll make it more integrated, right? So there'll be more connections. And right now there aren't many great connections between BART and regional rail. So that program together will have sort of multiple projects. The first one of which will be a crossing and sort of the supportive ancillary projects that will be needed to do that. But we see this as more of a suite of projects that will and with sort of an integrated network of passenger rail.
Well, that's a really good point because I think the big bang of a project everybody's going to talk about is that crossing, but also there is a need for a network of or a system of transit expansion in the Bay Area that will impact the way people get around, especially since the system we have now is in comparison with many other regions, Paris and London and Singapore and Hong Kong and those types, it's somewhat limited. And so if we start to think about these larger projects, it starts to get to be I guess, a bigger discussion than just a crossing.
Yeah, and if that crossing is serving regional rail, the regional rail connection already goes way beyond the 6 county Bay Area of what BART serves, right? So it's linking those things, and not just at that crossing point. There will likely be other hubs where these different rail services connect, possibly new alignments. So we're really looking at that overall program to understand sort of what the needs are, what the potential is, what we want to serve, and then through that, we will, develop an alternative that has the right crossing that will help enable that network. It's a lot of really plannerly talk. I get it.
This is a Plannerly podcast.
I know.
I like that. I think one of the worries that I had about, even coming into this discussion was I'm grumpy about a second crossing, not because I don't want one and not because I haven't drawn one on a map before when I made my crayon maps, as the crayonistas call it. I think that it would be a super benefit. Obviously, if you get into the weeds, you can talk about the gauges and whether it's going to be standard or BART gauge, et cetera. But I also am just frustrated by, how long stuff takes to get done. Here in San Francisco, we have the Central Subway. Obviously, that was not a preferred project for many transit advocates, but it was a political deal that got done. That's taken forever and it's still not open yet. And so I'm looking at that 2040 timeline, and we can get into that in a second about, the timelines and how long things take. And I'm just like, I'm going to be retired by then. I won't even be able to use it to get to a meeting or whatever. It's like that process is just frustrating. But if you start to kind of open it up like a butterfly, then you can have this discussion about the greater good of a region rather than just maybe one project. And I think maybe in the coverage that's been happening so far, that's gotten lost to a certain extent. I know there's been coverage about regional rail, but then they show a map and it's not very exciting. And, that's the discussion that happens. So yeah. I'm wondering if you're feeling the same way or if what I just said was complete crazy.
No, I think, listen, everybody's grumpy about how long it takes to do these things and how much it costs. And I feel that pain. We're definitely looking at it. One of the things we are doing is this business case, all the development framework, which, it's not only based on the economics of something, but it's a really sort of meticulous way of evaluating different alternatives to one another. I think sometimes in the past, meaning planners, have let the environmental review process do that for us in California, at least, to choose the preferred alternative. And I disagree with that being what CEQA was meant to do. And so what we're trying to do is set up this framework through this business case of, after we have these universe of alternatives, really be able to evaluate them upon these metrics of like, what are the goals? How do we want to serve them? And how do they line up? And then, eventually it'll be the cost benefit ratio, operability, how are we going to fund it? And to your point about the Central Subway, funding does come into play at some point, right? And we all know that. And especially in California, and the way that we have our different transit agencies not really all working together, it's inevitable at some point. But really, this business case alternative framework is to help us move through that process and then make decisions and hopefully move forward from those decisions so that we're not moving backwards. We're picturing it like a funnel of, getting to the right alternative, which will be both that program and then that project.
I think the grumpiness is about how long it would take to get stuff done, how much it's going to cost, whether it benefits the right people. A lot of the economic reporting on a second crossing, or even just generally, talks about, I was reading something this morning that said economic bonanza. And I was like, for who? Who does it benefit? And I think that's a frustrating part too, is, we can build these systems, but how do we get to a point where it's actually giving people opportunities to get to jobs that need that opportunity rather than folks that might not need it, or giving landowners increases in property values that maybe should be captured in some form or fashion. We can talk about all these things, but I guess 26-year-old me would have blogged about this and said, this is an amazing thing. It's going to do this, and it's going to do this. And then 40-year-old me is like, ugh.
Yeah. No, I get you. Especially because the timeline really lines up with my retirement path. So you can at least hold me that 2040 number. No, but in all reality, it's a challenge. But I think too, some of your points about, who is it going to serve? How do we make sure, the project we're picking is correct? I think some of this program, we've spent a lot of time in this Plannerly world to set up this business case framework because we want to do the right thing to make those decisions. And that takes some time, right? Like right now we're doing a market analysis. We're trying to understand where people go, where they want to go, unmet need. And then COVID happens, right? And then so all of that changes. And I've really tried to say since the beginning, it's a blessing in disguise that it's happening now when we are in this phase where we can really change, right, to accompany the changes that are going to happen with people's travel patterns and such. And, the Bay Area has a jobs housing imbalance, which is like, I feel on a daily basis. I think one of the things we've been trying to do is really through this vision in our equity statement, think about how we make sure we're developing a program and project that do meet the needs. And I think that really does mean, specifically transit dependent riders, our essential workers. I mean, the BART system really was a suburban commuter rail system, which caters to the 9 to 5 office worker, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what it was for the time, and it met that need. But I think especially now when you see who's still riding BART and the fact that there are a number of people that listen, we are serving like still 11% of ridership. I think that's a lot of people who are using BART because they need it to get to their jobs, and mm-hmm. like essentially the service industry and our essential workers. So, we've had a commitment to equity since the beginning, but I think this pandemic has really highlighted sort of that need and that responsibility.
Yeah. To what extent are you all going to be looking at kind of other examples of bigger expansion projects? I mean, right now, Crossrail is happening in London. The Grand Paris is happening outside of Paris, the regional rail expansion that's going on. Obviously, there's expansion of systems in China and other places. How much kind of outside research is going to happen to take the best practices and come up with something really good?
Yeah, that's a good question. Crossrail has been one of the things that we've looked at the most in terms of this business case framework and this idea of stage gates, which are essentially linked. But, a stage gate is sort of programmed decision points within which you are at a point where you're making a decision of whether or not you're going to continue investing time and resources into a project. And, and then when that decision is made, you're moving on with that work and developing work for that next stage gate. The Crossrail example, there's a lot of reasons why these international examples don't always align up with American systems, but I think we are trying to learn what we can from them. And so I would say, the business case is something that's been used actually, I think most recently in Ontario, as they've used it for their overall, I think, transit network to prioritize need. And then the stage gates comes from Crossrail.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that has been a lot of discussion on Twitter, et cetera, for this kind of group of folks that I follow is the costs of transit projects. And, has put out some work. The folks at, I think it's the Marin Institute, have put out a bunch of things as well talking about this. And it's kind of become a big discussion because it feels like American projects are so expensive. And, the problem with that is that we get less project for more money a lot of the times when you think about the Second Avenue subway and Long Island East Side Access and those types of projects. So I'm wondering like how much that comes into play as well, especially when you're talking about, whether to cut off a project or not in the future.
Yeah, we have done a lot of thinking about this because, as you said, it's a common question or critique. And I wish I had all my smart people behind me in the corner, like so I could just point to the right one and say, help me with those sound bites. And I think it's true. And I think also sometimes the way in which we look at our costs and compare our costs is a little bit different. For instance, with countries that have, universal health care, the salary that someone's paid, doesn't include the salary that in America might also include their benefits, which include healthcare. And that's a huge, actually, percentage of salary when you break it out. And so that's just one example of how it is actually really hard to compare the cost analysis to sort of non-American examples, I guess.
Yeah, it's a good argument for universal healthcare.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. You have a podcast on that right after this, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Times of universal healthcare. And as an independent business here, I'd appreciate that as well. My stuff's expensive, so I understand that argument. What does the process look like to get this project going and towards that 2040 timeline?
Well, we are up and underway. BART, we have a procurement out to get more consulting services. There's a lot of work to be done. We have to do some level of conceptual design and engineering at some point. And clearly, there's the environmental process, which I'm sure you're aware of in terms of the California specific environmental process. And then there's the federal process. So there's a lot to do. We hope to have sort of this program of alternatives, like the program defined within 2 to 3 years. And then at that point, it'll be more clear sort of like what that first project and those sets of projects will be. And listen, I think you said it before, crayons on the napkin sort of thing. People love to draw lines on the map, and I can't wait till we're at the point, which is coming soon, but where we can say, like, give us your lines on the map, or, tell us exactly what it is you want this service to do for you. And so we're going to be starting that engagement fairly soon, maybe not the lines on the map so soon. But again, with 21 counties, we have like millions of stakeholders. But at some point in the next, 2 or 3 years, we're going to need more money to keep going. And then, if that money isn't available, then that timeline that we talked about before is just going to, grow with fits and starts depending on funding sources. So we have some hope that the new administration will be a little bit more friendly to transportation. And so, looking forward to what's going to come out of the administration in the next couple of months.
Yeah, I think that's one of the frustrating things too about politics generally is that you have these terms of leaders that come into office and then leave office at some point. And on both sides of the aisle, it's not a Republican or Democrat thing. It's just you have these changes in priorities. And so I think one of the frustrating thing about a project that, might actually be ending in 2040 is that you'll have a bunch of shift in priorities in the meantime. And so how do you keep that funding going? And I know we have a friendly administration for hopefully more than the next 4 years, but for the next 4 years at least. What does that mean going forward if that gets switched up? Or, as we've seen with California high-speed rail, the funding started in the Obama administration. It kind of dried up in the Trump administration, and now maybe it'll come back in the Biden administration. It's just that switching on and off of priorities one way or the other that might be frustrating. That definitely has an impact on what you all are trying to do.
Yeah. And, to get back to the timeline question, then it's no wonder that American projects take longer, right? With sort of unreliable funding sources. So I think a lot of mega projects are looking into public-private partnerships. And I think you mentioned value capture before. I mean, I think these are all things that we're going to have to consider when we're thinking about financing stream for the project. And hopefully, as I said, in the next 2 or 3 years, when we know a little bit more exactly what this program is, then we'll have some more solid numbers and a better answer in terms of what it is that we need exactly when and where.
You mentioned the California State Rail Plan, and then also the MPO, MTC has plans as well. How is this going to get tied into the overall system? I think right now there's a regional discussion about, integration of fares and things like that. But this project, if it moves forward, should be benefiting a regional system. And I'm wondering how that fits in as well.
Yeah. So MTC, which is the regional planning agency, they just finished their 2050 Plan Bay Area. Within that plan, they do a project evaluation where they're looking at the cost benefit ratio of projects. And so the crossing is in there, and it came out as the most sort of cost effective mega project for the region. And that is with the understanding that it's not defined as BART or regional rail, just sort of like the inputs and of what it would serve. And certainly, the state is updating the state rail plan right now, which is also good timing. And so I think your question is also sort of relating to some of the discussions that are happening in the Bay Area about transit agencies and their governance and sort of the call for more seamless integration between the agencies. And, I think that those calls have been heard. And I think that this program, our goal is to be integrated and seamless and affordable. I'm not quite sure how exactly we get there, but I'm hoping that this program can align, with the same time that some of those discussions are happening in the governance realm, so that in the future we will have sort of a more clear understanding of governance operations. It's a hard one, right? Because there's definitely smarter people than I am sort of having those discussions, and I'm happy to be over here thinking about a project that will hopefully learn from them.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of, I'll just call them fiefdoms in the Bay Area, and it's hard to get the folks all to work to get on the same page with that. But hopefully we'll get there. I'm looking forward to the Bay Area Verkehrsverbund myself.
Well, we are like coordinating with all the rail agencies and transit agencies. And I can say that at the meetings when it's staff and executives, like everyone's on board with the vision, and I mean, that's typical, right? But at least we're on board with the vision and we'll figure out how to get there. And I'm sure there will be small battles won and lost on many sides. But I mean, we're all a bunch of really, I think, committed planners ultimately, and it's just those fiefdoms of the greater good and then how we're going to slowly sort of juggle the pieces to get there.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's maybe too optimistic, but
I like it. What's been the feedback so far of the project? Like, what have you heard from folks that have seen kind of some of the introductory stuff? What have they been saying?
So far, there's been a lot of enthusiasm. Frankly, the one lesson I've learned over my career is don't read the comments. So I don't get too deep into the comments. I mean, certainly we'll be going out to the public and asking them for their participation, and we haven't quite done that yet. So, from sort of a publicity standpoint, it's been pretty good for the most part. There's been a lot of questions to the similar ones that you're asking right now, like, why so long? How much is it going to cost? Like, how are we going to pay for it? Who's going to operate it? And those are all really valid questions.
What's the biggest question you have?
Ooh, that was a really good question. Gosh.
Well, maybe I should ask also, in addition to that, what are you excited about the most?
I am really excited that I feel like this last year has been super hard for everyone. And this program, it is a ways off, but it has also been an opportunity, I think, for BART and our partners to double down on equity, which we have talked around a little bit, but we have to acknowledge the disparate impacts that large infrastructure projects have had on communities of concern, communities of color, low-income communities, non-English speaking communities, both, I think, physically by destroying neighborhoods in some instances, and also just, not sharing in the benefits of a project. And so I am really proud that we've made this commitment to equity, and with our bigger BART support. And I think BART's done a great job in the past of prioritizing equity. And this is sort of like the next step building upon that in terms of the vision of what that means for the future. And so we were thinking about it in many ways, and I have a lot to learn in this realm as well, but it's both process and outcome. Like, how do we make sure that we're talking to the right people, maybe the people who haven't been engaged in the past because they didn't feel like their voice mattered or trust in government, or maybe they weren't asked previously. So we're trying to have early and prolonged discussions with some of those communities by going to the communities, working with community-based organizations to meet those communities where they are and, talk to them in trusted spaces with people that they already have a relationship with. And that's super daunting too, because it's a long time. It's a multi-generational program, right? So essentially we're planning for our kids, which is really great for me because about that time my kid will want to drive and have a car, and there's like no way that's ever going to happen. So he gets a free BART pass with my employment, so it's a bonus. So it's not only this process of like engaging with people, but I think it's also the outcomes in terms of like being really strategic about how we look at these communities. And this is where it gets into all the smart, market analysis, ridership people that are, just doing all the really thoughtful analysis on the back end. But how do we identify those transit dependent riders, like figure out where they are and make sure that they're benefiting from this project? Obviously we want everybody to benefit from it. We want people to get out of their cars and into BART, but we also want to make sure that we're serving the people who have that really specific need, who maybe aren't being met with transit opportunities now, especially as that jobs housing imbalance grows and people leave the expensive Bay Area to the outer counties to find affordable housing.
Yeah, I think it's a tough question. I mean, I often kind of wonder if given the opportunity to voice their opinions, whether folks who are impacted the most would actually want these bigger projects, or they appreciate the smaller kind of incremental changes that we can make, whether that's improving transit service or I'm always curious, like whether these days at least, whether the projects are actually answering the calls. And I think we've learned a lot from what's been happening during the pandemic. And I know that folks in Oakland have learned a lot from their Slow Streets program. Around the country, we've learned so much about what people want and what they ask for versus kind of what planners, to a certain extent, sometimes assume more than maybe we should. So that's a lesson that's learned. And I hope that we can address that going forward. I want to circle back to the last question. Maybe I'll give you a little time to think about it, but what questions do you have about the project, or what's something that hasn't been answered, maybe that you're interested in answering or getting answered?
What's not getting answered? That's such a good question. I mean, I have so many questions, right? As the director, I feel I'm typical planner, like dabble in everything, but master of none, so it'll be really interesting to look at the analysis, especially as we're not only looking at future ridership trends, but I mean, I think all of us have the question of how transit will respond after the pandemic. Like, will we ever see a time in our lives that someone's ever going to be willing to get on a crowded BART train again? Like, literally, the last ride home from my last day at the office was like a major crowded BART train. And I just think in my mind, wow, like who knows, will I ever experience that again? And so I think that remains to be seen. I think that certainly people will change their patterns in at least the near term. And so, I think that there's a lot of smart people who know how to start to answer those questions. And I'm waiting to see, we are in the middle of bringing on new consultants. And it's amazing the people that are out there that really just want to work on this project because they know the really fun and huge questions that we're going to be asking. I don't know if that's that great of a question. I mean, of course, it's like, what's COVID going to do? I mean, I'm sitting in my bedroom talking to you. It's not ever how I expect, how I expected my career to progress.
Yeah, I think one of the questions for me is about what value is and what we value. We have all these projects and we talk about money. We talk about how much stuff costs. I'm obviously sensitive to that. But recently I've had discussions with folks on the show talking about, reductions in poverty and thinking about, what people actually need to get places and what kind of value the transit investments we make create for communities, whether that's connecting people with jobs, it's connecting the employers with workers, it's connecting people with healthcare, it's connecting people with all of these things. And none of those things necessarily gets calculated into the calculus when you look at a kind of a base number of this is how much it costs, this is the cost benefit analysis, this is the cost per rider, this is that type of thing. And also we've made decisions in the past, and not just here in the Bay Area, but around the country, where we take the path of the least resistance. We go down freight corridors instead of through population centers. And my family, my grandmother's lived in Lafayette since 1963. And what would have happened if they would have not gone down the center of the freeway and instead gone down the center of Mount Diablo Boulevard underneath? Or what happens if you go into the center of Walnut Creek versus on the edge? Those types of decisions have long-term ramifications. And it's frustrating sometimes because it says, the cost is this is what the benefit is, and we're going to do it this way because it costs less, rather than looking at the long-term impacts. I think that question of value is something that we have yet to kind of reconcile in our discussions about infrastructure and our discussions about transit expansion. So we have these kind of upper level discussions when we should be looking deeper.
Yeah. That was very eloquently said. And I think that those are actually some of the things that we are trying to look more closely at and will be sort of tackling in the next couple of years. Theoretically, it's a hard question, right? In terms of how do you assign numbers to some of these things? Like, it's easy to assign numbers to ridership so that we can, pop it into our business case. But when we're talking about access, or access to food resources, or there's so many things. And then I remember that we're just a transit agency, right? And we don't have land use authority. And so we have the best of all intentions. Ultimately, we have to put our stations and our alignments somewhere. And then that's a whole nother level of thoughtfulness, or maybe perhaps unthoughtfulness. And so, to me, that's where the crux is, because that's where it becomes a political challenge at times. And I think in terms of value, I think we are perhaps understanding a little bit more how to value, at least in the Bay Area, the lives of others, and understand how, like, when everyone thrives, we all thrive. But then you turn on the news and it's, some people can't even wear a mask, not to get political,
That's not political. That's science.
Science.
I know what you mean, though.
And I think, to then sort of the monetary value of things, it's like everyone is not going to be happy by this. Sometime we are going to end up going in communities where there are people that don't want us, whether it's, NIMBYism, or whether it's, fear of gentrification, which is a very, very legitimate fear, right? And then it becomes, we have to be here, right? How do we ensure that we are not, disenfranchising people that live there, pushing people out of their communities? How do we enable, like, both of these things to exist simultaneously? How do we bring that benefit to the local community, right? And those are hard questions, and they're not only transportation planning questions, they're big policy questions. So yeah, I guess those are the things. I don't know if they're questions, but they're just like, they're moments that I'm both looking forward to, and I know they're coming, and I just question how it's all going to play out. And then, to your point, an understanding of the Bay Area, there are very different communities very close to one another. So some that are very supportive of transit and affordable housing, and then others that just aren't. And so, when you draw a line between two places, we got to go somewhere, whether it's above ground, underground, can't always go around. And so I think that will be very challenging. And I know that we think we're progressive in the Bay Area, and for, a lot of ways we are, and in some ways we're not. In some ways we're not consistently progressive, right?
Yeah.
I know that BART is doing some amazing TOD work, and I live not far from the North Berkeley BART station, where it's been really amazing to watch the YIMBYism movement sort of just grow, and drive around and see, I want TOD in my backyard, I want affordable housing here. Like, that's amazing, and it's not everywhere, and it's certainly not even everywhere in Berkeley, right? So
yeah. Well, so last question. What about the environmental impacts? So obviously we have California, we have cap and trade, we have this discussion about sea level rise, we have climate impacts. There's been a lot of discussion lately about particulate matter, especially as pertains to like rubber particles going into the bay. I'm curious how the project might fit into our kind of environmental goals, and maybe into a larger discussion about California's environmental goals.
Yeah, I mean, we have ambitious goals in California. And I mean, I think really it comes down to, we need ambitious projects to meet those ambitious goals, right? Congestion is huge in the Bay Area, and the only way to really deal with that is transit and sort of more thoughtful land use. I know, as part of that analysis, MTC's analysis I was talking about, this project is really necessary for us to meet the region's 9-county GHG reduction goals. I think you mentioned sea level rise, and I think that's going to be major, because if you look at sea level rise predictions for the future, it's already going to impact rail, right? And so I'm hopeful that this is an opportunity for us to advance our thinking on that, and what that means for our transit planning and transit infrastructure, frankly. I think there's also just earthquakes, right? Which is, I think, a major success story of BART, in that the last major earthquake, we were up and running, I don't know, within hours, and really enabling people to get home that day, when bridges weren't available. And ultimately, another crossing will allow a level of redundancy for any of those potential impacts as they arise. So I guess, I don't want to say that our project is the panacea for all climate change, because that would keep me up at night. But I think, to the point of, like, we have big problems. We need big solutions. I think this is one of them. I don't think it's the only solution, right? But it's going to keep greenhouse gases out of the environment. How many? Well, remains, actually, some smart person on my team could probably tell you exactly how many. I can't right now, but yeah, in coordination with all of these other things that we need to be doing, right? So I don't mean to come across like I'm not that myopic to think that transit is the only solution, but it's one of them. And I think you and I have both talked about land use policy, and housing and transportation are sort of one and the same when we're talking about that problem.
Yeah, for sure.
We're going to be reaching out to our community. So if you're listening and you live within our service area, please go to our website, link21program.org, and sign up for updates. There's a survey, and that'll be really, at least for this near term where we still are in this virtual pandemic environment, we'll be doing our outreach. So
what's the first date? Is there a date already set for meetings, or just kind of watch this space?
Yeah, watch this space. And I think we're, to the point of trying to meet people where they are, trying to piggyback on some existing meetings that different locations and regions might have. So just, look for us a little bit more. BART and Capital Quarter have some amazing social media presence, so we'll be out there as well. Yeah, I hope that I can come back and, fill in some of those answers I couldn't get to and tell you more about our project.
I'm looking forward to that. Well, Sadie Graham, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire, on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old Daily Cities news list, by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.